Okay, thank you. So I'm here from San Francisco to tell you about what banks are going to look like in the future and how to build them. The biggest problem with Bitcoin to date, as many of you know, is fraud and security. So those are what Coinbase and myself personally have addressed head on here. So I hope you'll learn something. So this is an email I sent to a friend in June 2011. I said the primary risk is not with cryptocurrency as a protocol, but with the security on the websites on which the trading takes place. So little did I know that in about 2 years, I'd be working on security at the largest cryptocurrency bank in the world. But I had a deep academic interest in Bitcoin very, very early and wanted to move that into the industry as quickly as possible. I recognized pretty early that there might be multiple blockchains and multiple cryptocurrencies, which now you're seeing the growth of Ethereum being an example of that, something that Coinbase actually launched very recently. So this is what Coinbase used to look like. I'm on the right side there. This was our entire company. We were operating out of an apartment. It was kind of the classic Silicon Valley startup story. This is the company now. We're actually about almost double this size from when this photo was taken and have transacted billions of dollars both in cryptocurrency exchanges between dollars, euros, pounds, and Bitcoin, as well as Bitcoin to Bitcoin transactions. So when you're actually looking at the website, this is what it looks like. We're basically trading Bitcoin mostly through an API. It's mostly programmatic high-frequency traders. It also means that we're storing a huge amount of Bitcoin. So I want to talk about one thing that we've had to deal with a lot, and that's this guy. So this is a real photo of a hacker that was actually distributing malware to our customer support employees. So this is a real photo of a real hacker who was targeting us. And this was a big problem for us, right, and other Bitcoin companies, is how do you deal with hackers who are coming at you from basically every angle? So before I delve too deeply into that, I want to take a quick aside to talk about another big problem that's a little bit outside of Bitcoin but very much related to it, and that's identity theft. So the way we mostly think about identity theft is this physical attack, right? A lot of people have this idea of stealing from a mailbox, going through your credit card receipts, or something like that. I want you to rethink about this in a completely digital environment because this is where identity theft is actually happening. And really what it comes down to is account takeover of your online banking. This is really where the bulk of identity theft happens, is going into your online banking and determining your account username and password or your credit card number and basically masquerading as you on the internet. So how big is this problem of identity theft? So 7% of US residents over 16 were victims of identity theft in 2012. This is a lot of people. 2012, by the way, is the last year there are good statistics for this. I think it's actually gotten a lot worse in the last 4 years. So that's 17 million people a year in the United States alone. It's a pretty big deal. And 85% of this involved the use of credit card or bank account info. So once again, it's sort of an online attack. And to give you an example of how this is growing, this is actually the global volume of phishing attacks. So phishing is where you make a fake website, and it's designed to steal passwords from users. So when the user goes to the fake website, they enter their real password. You use that password to log into the real website and steal their identity. So how bad is this? So this is month by month. Global phishing site volume, 117,000 sites were taken down for phishing just in the month of January 2015. It's big business, right? People aren't doing this because they're not making money. It's very profitable. So what are the top targets of phishing sites? Somewhat predictably, it's financial institutions. People are basically making phishing sites, logging into your online banking, and spending your money. This is where all of this money comes from. So losses from identity theft are $24 billion per year. So to put that in perspective, this is double the loss from all property crimes combined. This is burglary, robbery, and auto theft combined. So identity theft is really the main way regular people are having money stolen from them. And I want to reframe this problem. It's really about online security. Because your accounts are vulnerable, this is why this $24 billion can be stolen through 117,000 phishing attacks a month. So I want to reframe this problem of identity theft as a security problem. And really, if we can solve online financial security, we then can solve this identity theft problem. Because identity theft is a problem unique to the internet, right? It's sort of asinine, it's sort of crazy that before the internet I could steal your identity, right? I would have to physically look like you. So you can only do that when there's a username and password going through a digital interface. So anyway, while we're sort of burning up this $24 billion, there's a big question that I ask myself, and it's who's winning and losing in this system, right? So as it's set up today, who's benefiting and who's not benefiting, and why is it set up in such a crazy manner? So when you look at whose loss this is, and this is looking specifically at the automated clearinghouse, or ACH, system in the United States. So many of you might not be as familiar with this, but there's basically three parties here. The user who got their identity stolen, the bank processing the payment, and the merchant receiving the payment. So if the chargeback, and this is where the user basically calls the bank and says, I don't recognize this charge on my credit card. If the user does that within 60 days, the merchant is fully responsible for all of that loss. And so merchants call this fraud, and this leads to $24 billion lost in e-commerce every year. If the user notices this theft after 60 days, then actually they eat the loss, and the merchant is no longer liable, right? So there's like a time window in which the user can report this. And banks did this really smart thing, which is they said either the merchant is going to lose money or the user is going to lose money. We aren't going to lose any money. So they really externalized all of that risk. Why did they do that? Why was the system set up that way? Well, the reality, it wasn't. So credit cards and ACH both existed long before the internet existed. And these payment protocols were based on very old systems that were often designed sort of pre-computers. And so these systems have just been hacked onto the internet. As digital commerce has grown, the payment rails really have not. So these payment mechanisms we're using are very, very archaic, but we're still using them over the internet. And it means that there are these weird problems like identity theft. And another weird problem is that if I send money to Australia, it's actually faster for me to take a briefcase of cash and fly to Australia than it is for me to send money over the internet to Australia, which is totally insane. It's like we're still caught in the world of physical mail instead of email when it comes to payments. So all of this $24 billion loss is basically distributed among all merchants accepting online payments. Now, it's a really large number, but it's really not one person, right? It's a large group of people distributed very widely, all taking this loss. So every single merchant accepting payments is taking this burden. And if you work at a company or operate a company that accepts online payments, you're very familiar with the fact that a large percentage of these payments are done with a stolen identity and are ultimately going to end up in loss and are not good money. So what is the solution to this problem, right? The moment credit cards were available on the internet, people were stealing credit card numbers and buying things with them. So what happened? What happened is, over the last 20 years, a massive anti-fraud industry has cropped up. And what this whole industry, multi-billion-dollar industry, exists to do is just identify between two different users who are trying to purchase something online, which one is authentic and which one is using a stolen identity. This is a massive problem, right? And there's a huge industry around it, and what I like to call it is the world's largest, highest stakes game of whack-a-mole ever played, right? Because you literally have to decide for each and every single customer whether they're using a stolen identity or whether they're an authentic user. There's no scaling efficiency, there's nothing. You just have to decide for every single user. And you're rejecting good users, you're letting through bad users. It's a big problem if you've ever operated in an e-commerce environment. So banks have no incentive to create better account security and thus solve this identity theft problem because they're externalizing all of the risks, and they will never do this voluntarily. So the way I think about this is if we're really going to get a solution, it needs to come from outside of banks. Banks and payment companies are not going to voluntarily start taking on the risk of loss from stolen identities and fraud. So Bitcoin, though, is really different. And I know you thought this is a Bitcoin talk, so here we go. So I think Bitcoin offers a solution. And it's because Bitcoin has a new security paradigm for the way payments and authentication work on the internet. So some basic characteristics of Bitcoin. It's basically e-cash. It's pseudonymous, so you don't really know who's moving what where, sort of like a $20 bill in your wallet. It's peer-to-peer, so it's sent direct from point A to point B, irreversible, instant, and global, right? So Bitcoin has this amazing feature where I can send $1 from my mobile phone to a mobile phone anywhere else in the world, and it will show up instantly. The downside of that is that there are massive security risks, which I'm going to get to. And kind of in one picture, what sums up Bitcoin to me is this. So this is a guy who held this sign up at a football game. This somehow wound up behind a television reporter and on the TV screen, and $23,000 was sent to this Bitcoin address, okay? So there are weird things that are happening because you can just send money to a QR code that's on your television screen. What this means for Bitcoin, though, and for Coinbase, is that there's really no identity theft in Bitcoin banks, right? You don't take over an account that's filled with Bitcoin and go to an online merchant and spend that Bitcoin and try to buy a bunch of designer purses or watches and then sell them on eBay or something like that. When you gain access to Bitcoin, it's instantly gone. It's like finding a bag of cash, right? You just put it in your pocket. So when Bitcoin accounts are compromised, the money is instantly gone. It vanishes out of thin air. There's really no way to trace that. It's just gone when it's gone. What this means for companies like Coinbase that are operating Bitcoin banks is that risk pivots away from merchants to the banks themselves. So when your online banking account gets compromised, that money gets spent at merchants, and that $24 billion is being lost by those merchants, right? With Coinbase, when you compromise Coinbase, it's actually our and our users' money, and we're taking on that risk of that monetary loss, right? There's no such thing as a chargeback for a merchant accepting a Bitcoin payment. It's 100% good money. There's no fraud. So I think a very important question when you think about these traits of Bitcoin are these features or bugs, right? Is this irreversibility, this instantaneous settlement, this ability to send money globally, is this really a good thing or is it a bad thing? So when you look at the history of Bitcoin, it's riddled with high-profile attacks that have resulted in the better part of $1 billion being stolen, right? So when you look at the track record, it's not great, right? There's a lot of Bitcoin banks that have basically been hacked within 1 or 2 years of starting. So how can Coinbase, which is the largest Bitcoin bank that's ever existed, have 4 million users and store over 1 million Bitcoin on behalf of those users and not have these problems? This is, by the way, 10% of all Bitcoin in circulation. So we do this with a few things that we've had to completely design from the ground up. The first one is private key storage. So this is actually storing the cryptographic key pairs that constitute the ability to send Bitcoin. User account security. So again, this is logging in, your username and password. And then finally, payment fraud. And this is us actually receiving credit card payments in exchange for handing out Bitcoin. So these are problems that no one had ever faced before. How do you store 1 million Bitcoin? How do you create an online banking environment that really cannot get compromised? There's no getting the money back if someone gets compromised. And thirdly, how do you receive dollar payments or euro payments and pay back Bitcoin? So I'll go over these one by one and how Coinbase has really designed the security mechanisms around these to create a Bitcoin bank. So the private keys, this is the #1 thing. This is what hackers want. It's if you gain access to a Bitcoin private key, it's the ability to spend that money. It's sort of like a password to your email. It's the ability to access your email. And this is the most important thing. We have 1 million Bitcoin stored on these private keys. So the first thing that we did is something called Shamir secret sharing. So Shamir secret sharing is kind of an esoteric academic piece of cryptography that was created years before Bitcoin, and no one thought it was useful. Everyone thought this is like just an exercise in academia, but it really didn't mean anything. Once Bitcoin came out, it became really, really useful. So what Shamir secret sharing is it takes a private key, and it splits it into multiple components that all must be recombined in order to recreate that private key. But the genius is it doesn't just split it into 3 components, and you need all 3. You can split it into 3 components, and you need 2 of the 3, right? Any 2. So you could split this into 12 components and need any 7 of those 12 to recreate. So what it means is it disperses the risk of those where those keys are stored geographically and among many different parties. So the way Coinbase sets this up is we actually take these private keys that are storing a million Bitcoin, we split it into multiple components, we distribute those components to many different people, and then they encrypt each of those components with a password, and those passwords are then stored in physical bank vaults on both pieces of paper and on flash drives. So basically what this means is an attack vector against cold storage, as we call it, would be completely non-cyber. It means that you would have to do a sort of Ocean's 11 style attack on a physical bank in order to get one of these keys. The main idea here is that we have security through consensus, right? No single individual, including the CEO of Coinbase, can access those Bitcoin private keys. You really need cooperation between multiple people in order to recreate those keys. And the main function here is, like I mentioned, cold storage. These keys are created offline. They never touch a computer that has ever touched the internet. And this is how we store 98% of our Bitcoin. And sort of a weird piece about Bitcoin is that you can actually send it from the internet to a piece of paper offline, right? Because it's all stored on this ledger, and no one knows where those keys are on this ledger, even if that particular key happens to be split into multiple components and encrypted and then just printed out on a piece of paper in a bank vault. So this cold storage is the most important thing we do, because any sort of cyber attack could never steal more than 2% of all the Bitcoin we hold. But there's another vector, and this is users' accounts, right? So even if our private keys are really secure and offline, our individual users can still have their accounts compromised through, for example, a phishing attack of a fake website, right? So this is a screenshot of a fake version of the Coinbase login page, okay? This wasn't actually Coinbase.com. This was some other website. But people make it look the exact same, and users enter their passwords. So there's a few things that we've had to do to kind of educate users and build a very secure account login mechanism. The first is two-factor authentication. So this is where you actually receive a token to your phone, and you have to validate that token as well as the password, right? So you remember the password, the token is always stored on your phone, and that token cycles, so it changes like every 20 seconds. Our users have to enter that token for every vital action on the website. On both login and on sending Bitcoin off-site, you are forced to re-enter that token. This means a lot of user education, right? Users have to get used to entering that token. The next one is device verification. So this means even if you enter your password correctly, and even if you enter the token correctly, if you are logging in from a device that we don't recognize, we actually send you an email, and you have to go into your email and authorize the computer, right? So even if an attacker, especially through a phishing attack, gains your password and gains your token, they still would need access to your email in order to log into your account. But everyone, is going to get their account hacked. So, right, even if your account gets fully compromised because your email was compromised, you have malware on your computer, the attacker had a keylogger and was able to get your password and two-factor token, we have the vault, okay? And the vault is a time-based withdrawal mechanism. You have to actually wait 48 hours in order to withdraw Bitcoin from the vault. So this is safe even in a situation where there's coercion, right? Someone could have a gun and say, pull the Bitcoin out of your Coinbase account, and they would have to wait with you for 48 hours because there's no way to get around it. So the vault is kind of the most secure user-facing mechanism that we have. It's sort of our version of a savings account. And then finally, it's us receiving payments and paying out Bitcoin. So again, when we receive a payment and that payment comes from a stolen identity, we actually take loss on that payment. So we take on a massive fraud risk as a company. And our margin on most trades is about 0.25%. So our fraud rate has to be extremely low in order for us to make a profit. So we do three things in order to deal with this. The first is data extraction. We know a handful of points about a user, their device, their IP address, things like that, and we actually use all sorts of third-party vendors in order to extract that more data about those points in order to determine more things about the user, many, many characteristics. So even when you hit our homepage, we know a lot about you. The second thing is our two competing machine learning algorithms. One is called SIFT, the other is called precog. We pass an enormous amount of data into these two different competing machine learning algorithms who both grade a user and determine how risky that user is. What this means is because we use a machine learning approach, our machine learning algorithms are fully adaptive. So as new scammer topologies occur, we can actually detect them in real time. Finally, the last one is we have a tiered logic engine. This means that based on all of those different machine learning scores, you go into a different user experience depending on what your score was. So if you have a bad score, you have lower limits. You have to go through more identity verification. This also ties into our manual review system, which building a good automated system means that manual operations have to scale non-linearly. You actually have to scale exponentially with users. This means making hard judgment calls in a more automated manner, and also making manual operations more efficient. Okay, so we've effectively solved these three problems and are created through that a different type of online bank. So what's the story here? The main thing is that Bitcoin and an online Bitcoin bank aligns the incentives, right, between users and merchants. There's no longer this externalized risk of $24 billion of loss. Bitcoin banks have to actually design better security. We can't fall back on the legal protections that banks have created around chargebacks and traditional payment rails. Bitcoin is not just a UI layer. It's actually a new protocol on how payments move. So the savings of Bitcoin commerce are then distributed among the users and merchants, right? Because merchants can receive payments, and there's no risk of fraud. This means lower prices for everyone and no fraud on the internet. Traditional banks depend on legal solutions to deal with their poor online security. And these systems, again, were never meant to be online, and it creates negative externalities for the rest of the internet. So instead of depending on those legal solutions, Coinbase actually creates technical solutions that solve the problems instead of externalizing all the loss. This is the way we can make physical bank vaults in an online environment and be just as safe. Okay, thank you all.